Good evening. My name is Gregory Warrow. I'm a professor of political science at Columbia University. I want to welcome everyone joining us this evening and express my gratitude to our panelists for taking time out of their extremely busy schedules to offer insights into what we can expect in the coming months as we barrel toward the 2024 elections. I think it is fair to say that each of our panelists has the potential to play an outsized role in how 2024 plays out. This event is sponsored by the new program in political analytics that we are launching at Columbia. The mission of the program is to provide graduate level training in the kinds of skills that professionals need to thrive in the increasingly data-driven world of politics. Our goal is to train a new generation of professional political analysts, consultants, and managers who are uniquely equipped in the substance of politics and quantitative methods to understand and communicate effectively with other professionals and lay people about political behavior and dynamics. Tonight's discussion will focus on substance. If you are interested in hearing more about the program and the application and admissions process, please join us for a virtual information session on February 1st at 6 p.m. Details and registration are available at the Political Analytics website, and we will drop a registration link in the chat toward the end of this evening's event. I'd like to thank the tremendous staff at the School of Professional Studies for their help in organizing this event, and especially the hard work that our moderator, Doug Usher, has put in to lay the groundwork for an important and insightful discussion about 2024. Before I turn it over to Doug, who will lead the discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Amy Kurtz is president of the 1630 Fund. She supports the work of donors and progressives across the country through fiscal sponsorship and is responsible for some of the largest financial investments on that side of the political spectrum. She has over 30 years in progressive electoral politics, including work with America Votes, Defenders of Wildlife Action Fund, the League of Women of Conservation Voters, and the Nature Conservancy. Thank you, Amy. Becca Siegel is an expert in using data to make decisions and was the chief analytics officer on the Biden campaign, in addition to serving as senior advisor to the White House COVID-19 response team. In her work for the Biden campaign, she managed a team of more than 160 data scientists, analysts, and engineers, and has learned way too much about delegate math. Becca is also a graduate of Columbia University, and so we welcome her back, at least in a virtual sense. David Winston is a Republican pollster and president of the Winston Group, a Washington, D.C. strategic planning and survey research firm. David has served as a strategic advisor to Senate and House Republican leadership for the past 15 years and has advised Fortune 100 companies on strategic planning and brand reputation. He is unique among Republicans in electoral politics in that he is a Manhattan native. Finally, our moderator, Doug Usher, is a partner at Forbes Tate Partners. He spent the last 2 decades building insights that have helped change the strategic trajectory of major corporations, industry associations, and political campaigns. Doug has helped build winning strategies and campaigns for clients across a broad range of industries, with a particular focus on the pharmaceutical and energy sectors. And with that, Doug, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Warrow. So I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists. We're going to go for a couple rounds of questions, and then after that, we will open the floor to the questions that come in, and I may grab 1 or 2 if they seem to fit right. So I'm going to start with Amy. Amy Kurtz, you work with organizations that work in and around election campaigns from the progressive side. Tell us a little bit about what your organization does and also what we should expect in 2024 from progressive groups that you fund.
So as the landscape among progressive organizations has changed, that's due to campaign finance reform, that's also due to the media landscape totally changing. Both those pressures have kind of caused the infrastructure to explode, and also as voters want more information and are harder to reach, the demands of grassroots groups that kind of do that work have become much more evergreen. We can't go talk to base voters in after Labor Day and say, hey, don't forget there's an election soon. The conversations have to go on all the time. That combined with the change, quite frankly, that all the campaign finance changes brought, pushed a lot of that infrastructure to C4 and C3 groups. I happen to run a large a large C4 group on the progressive side, and we work as a fiscal sponsor. Groups and donors come into us, and we strategically move that money back out to folks on the ground who do turnout, who do legislative campaigns, all for different progressive issues. That might be on guns, that might be on healthcare access, it might be on abortion access and reproductive freedom. We kind of run the gamut. We also do a ton of work on turnout, and I have a C3 counterpart that does a lot of work on registration. I could go on and on. The reason donors use fiscal sponsor structure and why that has kind of grown up and gotten really serious is two things. One, donors count on us to make sure the groups on the ground can just do their work and not get in trouble. We do all the back end stuff. We do their filings, we do their compliance, et cetera, their HR. Second, donors will come to us because maybe they don't want attention. If you donate to a C4, you are not disclosed. So that's kind of the part that I function at, but I think relevant to this conversation in 24 is so much of the activity that you thought individual campaigns and candidates were doing, actually, at least on the progressive side, and Mr. Winston can talk about the Republican side, but on our side, happens in this independent campaign space. And that is what I have specialized in for a long time. So anxious to be here and talk more, but that's the baseline.
Thanks, Amy. And just for those who may not know among our audience, C3 and C4 are IRS and tax designations.
That's right.
And just to give 15 or 30 seconds, because just to be clear, Amy's being a little bit modest. She runs an organization that has helped work to, funnel nine figures worth of money on the progressive side, which is, it uses the funnel, dark money, negative or positive. But the point is that keeping everything, of course, on the up and up is extremely important. So just give a quick, quick 30 seconds on the importance of that side of it.
Sure. So donors that give to a C3 organization are giving purely charitable money. That is not a political activity. Voters that are giving to candidates are giving very political money. All of that is disclosed. In the middle are two kinds of organizations. One is a C4, that is a social welfare organization. Donors, when they give to C4s, don't get tax deductions, but they can do legislative and political work, not directly with candidates, not directly with parties, but they do direct political work with that, those dollars. And then there's issue groups that also came around the time of campaign finance called 527s. Those are the groups that have less limits and do work on behalf of individual issues and candidates. Excellent. So that's the scope. And I sit in running a huge C4 on the progressive side.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So for you, David, let's getting back sort of more to the, Amy's talking about the inner workings of what is an incredibly important ecosphere in the world of politics. David, getting back to almost the front door or the glass window of politics, what are some things you're looking at and you're watching as Republicans start their campaigns for president that will help indicate who the nominee is going to be?
A challenging question, to say the least, because I think right now things are quite up in the air. Right now, I'm no surprise to anyone, most of the ballot tests that you're looking at in terms of the primary are basically name ID function, right? Who are people aware of and who they aren't? I'll go back to, we've seen I'll go back to my favorite one of all time, Herman Cain, who nobody knew, ended up having a good debate performance, and at one point in 2012 actually led the Republican primary at a national level, right? And so odd things can develop, but I think one of the challenges for people to watch in terms of the Republican side is, as this primary evolves, is it about personality or is it about policy? And that's going to be an important component, because I'm going to suggest to you for the base of both parties, personality plays an interesting role in terms of engagement with other conservatives or liberals, depending on the side. Independents really aren't focused on personality. They just want to know what is it that you're offering and what is it that you're suggesting as policy. So you tend to see sometimes primaries not necessarily do a great job of setting a candidate up for a general. And that's true for both sides generally. The other thing to look for on the policy side is there a candidate that emerges that really does try to focus on like one or two very specific policies in the hope that they can get some sort of not media attention per se, but just some engagement at a scale where in fact people begin to associate a specific direction for the country, as opposed to just this sort of broad sense of I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative, sort of dynamic. Actually, W. Bush was able to do that pretty effectively in terms of a tax cut and No Child Left Behind, and did a nice job of sort of developing that. The challenge then becomes is ultimately this is going to be a race against Joe Biden, but does the whole campaign become just a critique of Joe Biden, which again, that becomes very unsatisfactory for independents because they want to know what you're going to do, but tends to be one of the challenges that exists, I would suggest, in the campaign world at this point, is sometimes it's not the candidate versus the candidate. It's the opposition research report against the opposition research report that really just drives the whole dialogue, frustrating for everybody. So if it just becomes purely just a critique about Biden, just by the way, as it was just purely a critique about Pelosi, things don't always turn out the way some people think they should. And then the last thing in terms of to look for is, and this was not dissimilar to what happened on the Democratic side in 2020, debates are going to be the key. People are really going to pay attention. They're really going to come up with some thoughtful thought processes. And we'll just see how those go. And debates that make campaigns always nervous because that's something that's not under their control.
So I'm going to just try to pin you down a little bit on the Republican campaign, which is to say, look, there's a lot of talk. Trump is weak. DeSantis is on the rise. There's all these people preparing campaigns. What would be something that would indicate to you that Trump is no longer the titular nominee, the expected nominee?
Well, I think to some degree he has run into a significant problem in terms of this last election, and that is he had a series of Senate candidates who did not do well, and so I think there are a lot of Republicans who are thinking through what that means and how to adjust that. So I think that piece is going to play. You've seen some surveys out there recently showing that Trump leading DeSantis by a large margin. Again, that's where I just go to. It's a function of name ID. But again, those two individuals are likely to be competing for the same segment of the Republican electorate. And so the question is there somebody emerges who can, in fact, motivate or engage in another segment to be competitive? That's unclear. And that's really one of the first things to look for. Does somebody else begin to emerge out of that? And there are a broad range of candidates, at least at this point. And there always is. It's like, okay, we got 12 people to talk about, but there aren't going to be 12 people running, but there could be quite a few.
Excellent. Thank you. So to you, Becca, you work directly in data analytics, and you're considered one of the stars on the Democratic side. You came from the Biden campaign. What did you learn in 2020 that made a difference for Biden? And as we all know, the worst thing that campaigns can do is replay the last campaign. So what did you learn in 2020 that you think your approach to analytics might differ, if at all, in 2024?
Yeah, especially when it is potentially the same candidates running, especially dangerous then. But no, I think often when people ask this question, they're expecting like a methodological answer, like we fixed polling. We did not. We did not fix polling. We tried. But I think what we really focused on in 2020 was how to create a strategy that was resilient to a great degree of uncertainty. And 2020 had many reasons for extra uncertainty. I mean, COVID being one, but many reasons really. And I can sort of I'll give one example of what this led to. So we thought a lot about correlated uncertainty and error across states. And for all of the campaign, really, winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania was quite clearly the easiest pathway to 270 electoral votes based on polling. Our concern with that was that these states are correlated, the voters in these states are correlated. So if we are wrong in one of those places, we could be potentially wrong in all three. And that is maybe a lesson learned from 2016, which we learned very well. So when, I think it's well known that we invested a lot in places like Arizona and Georgia, which looked to be afterwards like, wow, how did they know that these were places that were, winnable? And the reality is that it wasn't that these places looked easy or easier to win. It's that they were really different from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So if we saw huge polling misses in the Midwest, like we had seen in 2016, we would have a strategy that was resilient to that. So what that means, I think, for 2024, I don't think we should ever be less uncertain. So I think baking in this kind of uncertainty is probably something that all campaigns should do, because polling is not getting easier. There are ways that we are working to improve its accuracy, but it remains quite difficult. And I think where we really may run into just the challenge of 2024, especially if we have the same two candidates running, is that people will say, so you already know how to, let's just do it that way again, right? And that is actually very counter to this whole case for, we don't really know what's going on. So how do we build strategies and voter outreach methods that are as resilient as possible to the whole litany of things that might go wrong? So I think that will be just internally, like inside the campaign, I think that will be the sales pitch that whomever the chief analytics officer will have to make, right? Is that we are not more certain about how this will go than we were before, even if it feels like exactly the same campaign again.
That's some pretty refreshing insight from a world where building in uncertainty goes directly against your incentives from clients and candidates alike.
So. Yeah. They're like, aren't we paying you to know?
Exactly. What do we need you for?
Yeah.
So to Professor Warrow, who I will quickly introduce because he did not introduce himself. He's a professor of political science at Columbia, where he specializes in Congress, elections, campaign finance, judicial politics, political economy, and political methodology. He's written across these fields, has a long list of books and articles that are too numerous to mention. Check his website for that. And then he is one of the leaders of this new Masters of Science program in political analytics. So to you, we've talked about, of course, about the presidential race, et cetera. You're also a congressional scholar, and we just saw a crazy speaker's race. And now we're going to go to a Congress that's heading into the presidential election. Just heard today that Marjorie Taylor Greene is jockeying to be the vice president for Trump. So, who knows what's next? How do you expect that all of this presidential jockeying might affect how a Republican-led House functions over the next 18 months, and how Democrats might react inside the House and the types of things that Congress can actually do in this period?
So for me, the biggest question here is, what is Donald Trump's status in the Republican Party, and how do expectations about him being the nominee evolve? So if Donald Trump continues to be the dominant force in the Republican Party, he will command loyalty to his agenda, and that's going to make it harder to go against the MAGA crowd. But if he falls out of favor and someone from the establishment wing of the party emerges, it should free up at least some members of Congress to side with that wing of the party, and could open space for some bipartisan compromise on a range of issues. I think that this would give cover for both Republicans and even Democrats to work together with less alienation of the respective bases of the parties, but perhaps more importantly, less concerned about being primaried in the future. One of the things that I think members of Congress have at least lived in fear to a certain extent over the past several years is Donald Trump basically identifying them as an enemy and supporting somebody to oppose them in a primary, which opens up all sorts of crazy dynamics. Of course, if someone else emerges as the front runner, they could frame the debate in a way that's similar to the way that Donald Trump has done it, in terms of whoever is not with us is against us. And so I think for me the real question is whether we get back to a place where some bipartisanship is possible. If you look at the history of when Congress actually functions and gets things done, it's when you have broad bipartisan support for legislation. We still get it occasionally, but I think it's become less common. But I think this is one of those areas where what we see in the presidential primaries will actually bleed into what happens within Congress. I mean, the Republicans have a very narrow majority. They have a caucus that is going to be hard to keep together. They can't afford to lose too many votes. Can they attract some Democratic votes? The leadership in the House, can McCarthy attract some Democratic votes to form a solid coalition that will be able to get things done? I think an early test of this is going to be what happens with the debt ceiling, and we're going to learn about that in the next the coming days and weeks.
Excellent, thank you. So going back to you, Amy. And we've been talking a lot about analytics and numbers. It's one of the reasons we're having this panel and, of course, this program. One thing that's been talked about and that people are starting to ask for, especially as campaign finance gets so much higher, and we do have high-dollar donors, many of whom have run successful businesses or done things like that, is they want a return on their investment. And a question for you is, what types of measures do you consider when you're funding organizations with your donors' money? What, if any, specific results do you expect? I'm sure you've gone through 2022 and now you're headed towards 2024. How do they use data and information to appeal back to you and in turn appeal back to your donors?
So that to me feels a little bit in the philosophical and not in the, wins and losses. And I've been doing this work so long that I've actually seen a lot of really down cycles. I'm thinking about 2010, 2014, those were great times for Mr. Winston, but not for our team. And we actually still had to keep the infrastructure going, and the data was really key. What could we measure? How did we enhance organizations on the ground? How did we enhance voter files in states, right? Did we start to build profiles around our voters and around turnout? What was the capacity elements? And we started kind of charting those and listing them and building on that. It was a function of, quite frankly, us needing to kind of look pretty deep inside and see what was going on. It was also a function of what are the things we can count that are wins, in a little bit of a cynical way, but it also helped build the infrastructure that I talked about that, quite frankly, that's been super helpful. When we talk about all the independents that are voting and how what we know about them, this is not just like consumer data and like what kind of cars they buy, but like we've talked to those voters, and we have had meaningful conversations that are very persuasive, and we've logged that. Now they may be a little old and we got to go back and people move and it's not perfect, but there is a lot of capacity and that we have counted, that gets me excited about a program like this, and like what the potential is,
Mhm.
all for, the good of progressive values.
So, and just to follow up on that, so wins and losses obviously really important. However, this is a 24/7, 365 operation, and so you are looking at data that goes well beyond election day. Is that
Right.
right?
And we are counting impressions, meaningful conversations, attempts at those conversations. We are doing all the analytics on all of these things, Becca probably more than most, right? Like, because we want to quantify and compare, but we also want like super good quality on those interactions. And I would say that as the infrastructure has gotten more sophisticated, so have the donors. And Trump makes people stay in the game because they're scared of Trump, but also like the data coming back says, okay, we didn't get the win here in 16, but look what we built up to in 18. One of the things we talked about a lot, was how great the turnout was in 18. Well, the turnout in 22 was pretty great too. That's a little bit about a reaction to the Supreme Court and a reaction to Trump, but it's also about in this really segmented media atmosphere, people having really meaningful conversations. I listened to somebody wax poetic about all the work that was done on the ground in Georgia in that short runoff period. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't close, and maybe it shouldn't have been close against Herschel Walker, but there was an incredible amount of high quality voter contact that happened on the progressive side, that was super meaningful to get us a progressive Jewish Democrat and a progressive preacher as our two senators from Georgia.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. So I'll turn to the more cynical side when I ask Becca this next question. So some have said, Becca, not necessarily me, but some have said that billions are being spent each election cycle. More is being spent each election cycle, but it feels like it's harder and harder to change anybody's mind. What can analytics tell us about how to invest campaign money wisely and how to best balance persuasion, turnout, and other goals in campaign efforts?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we do spend a lot of money and very few people are open to having their mind changed by our work. I think we can be realistic about that. It's hard to figure out who those people are as well. So even if we can find them, there's very few of them. The, I guess, good and bad news is that presidential campaigns are decided by very few votes. The last two have been decided by 50, 70,000 votes, something like that. So if that's a good use of $1 billion, I don't know, like the effective altruists can maybe like sort out if that's a good use of $1 billion. But when it comes to the act of spending it, which is my job, I think tactically, I'm increasingly of the opinion that there is very little distinction between turnout and persuasion work. And what I mean by that is that the idea that there are like these highly tuned in people who always vote, but are also always undecided each cycle is not particularly compelling to me and not something that the data really bears out. But what we do see is that there are people who are persuadable, and those are the people who have the least information about a candidate. And they also happen to be the people who are not particularly politically engaged. So if you're thinking, oh, well, that kind of sounds like a turnout voter, like the kind of voter we just show up at the end and we get them to vote, that's true. There's a lot of overlap, in my opinion, between the two. And there's a strong relationship between whether someone is persuadable and whether they are also sort of like on the fence about voting. So it sounds obvious, but people don't vote when they don't feel like they have a reason to, right? So the best reason we can give a voter to vote is to be motivated by the candidate they are voting for, or motivated against the candidate they are voting against, right? Whatever it is, that's like a persuasion element that is getting people to vote. And it's certainly something that we have started to much more broadly apply and did apply in 2020 and in 2022, which is we talk to what we would typically think of as turnout voters much earlier on. I mean, I think Amy has mentioned this as well. We've talked to them much earlier, and we're talking to them about issues and candidates. We're not just like, go vote, thanks so much. And then, 4 years later, we're like, please go vote again. Thanks so much, right? There's so much relationship between motivating people to vote and motivating them to support a candidate. So I think it's something we have to keep testing, but certainly 2022, good indication that persuasion was real. We could really move people. And I think that is the case going forward. So I'm just more and more of the opinion that those two things cannot be separated. It's really the same set of voters that we are talking about.
Excellent. That's great. That's really interesting. I think let's get back to this because I think this will relate to some of the chat. So to David, turning back to you, because, there are all kinds of indicators of challenges in Biden's presidency from a polling perspective, et cetera. His performance ratings look more like defeated incumbents, Bush Sr. and Trump, than they do winners of second terms. George W. Bush and Obama is just two recent examples. But Biden had a successful midterm cycle, right? First of all, is there a new normal that everybody hates everyone all the time, but in the end, they've got to choose somebody? But second, in this new world, what are some things or changes you're going to be looking at to gauge vulnerability with Biden and with other candidates up and down the line?
Well, let me start off. Sorry, I don't know that I necessarily agree with your conclusion that the idea that Biden won this election or he had a good election. I mean, the bottom line is he lost the House, right? And even having 222 when there was some expectation from some, not me, that this was going to stretch into 240. I mean, the bottom line is right now, because this is the way the House works, the minority has very little standing and the majority has huge standing. And so that's just strategically a completely different dynamic. And as was alluded to earlier, we're going to see that specifically right away in terms of the debt ceiling. But I think there are also mitigating circumstances for both parties that actually make things a lot more complicated for them. So I'm going to start with the Democrats first, then go to Republicans. According to the exit polls, in terms of party ID, Democrats had 33% of the electorate. That's the lowest historically that they have had since the start of exit polling. And to give you a sense of how bad 33% was, the next two numbers in terms of the next two, 35% was the next worst performance. That was 2010 and 2014 when Republicans basically routed the Democrats at the congressional level. We've been routed too at different points of time, but that was the big one. And Republicans had a +3 party ID advantage. Okay, the largest that they've ever had, 72 forward. So at least in terms of base turnout, Republicans did really well. So with a +3 party advantage, how many seats did we win? We won 222. Okay, back in 2010, the party ID advantage was even, yet we won 242 seats. That was +20. So what's the difference between those two elections? Well, in 2010, we won independents by 19. And this election, we lost them by 2, right? To give you a sense of just how amazing that number is, prior to this, the prior 17 out of the last 18 elections, independents voted for the party out of power. And the only one time was George W. in 2002, which was just a very different dynamic. So you had independents, despite the fact they were really angry about the economy, that they were really angry about this president in terms of what he was doing, basically split their vote between the two parties. And why was that? And there's a very specific number here. The independents were unhappy about the economy. 41% of independents said they thought the economy was not so good. Now you'd think for us, Republicans, that would be a great group, right? Okay, listen to the scale of this number. 41% of independents saying the economy is not so good. Democrats won them 62 to 33. That's why the red wave didn't happen. I mean, it's really very straightforward. And just to give you a sense, both parties have a challenge in terms of this. If you take a look at Biden's fave-unfave with independents, and this is from the exit polls. By the way, I'm quoting the exit polls. I do the CBS decision desk, so I just get lots of numbers. Okay, so sorry, everybody's stuck with lots of numbers. Biden's fave-unfave with them is 37 to 60. Okay, back in 2020, it was 51-46. It was +5 to 37 to 60. That's just a really bad place to be. But just to give you a sense, and some folks alluded here, his potential opponent, right, Donald Trump's fave-unfave with independents in terms of this election was 30 to 66. So basically, you have independents looking at potentially the two presidential candidates, basically kind of going, neither group particularly likes them. And it rubs off a bit on the party as well. And so the challenge that both parties have at this point is, what's their strategic plan for independence? And just to give you one last thing, in terms of how do people switch, we won independence by 19 in 2010. When Democrats won in 2006, they won independence by 18. So that was a 37-point swing in the margin amongst independents. And the reason I say that's a challenge, because again, both parties focus on their base, just last set of numbers. 17% of the electorate were liberal Democrats, 25% were conservative Republicans, that's the two bases, 58% were something else. And to some degree, our political discourse and the way we approach people politically, they need to understand that that's the dynamic of play. Sorry, I babbled a little bit too long there.
No, that's great. That's perfect. So I'm going to turn with one question for Professor Worrow, and we've got some in the chat, so we can move on to those in a minute. So Professor Worrow, there's money awash, or congressional races are awash in money. Was it that close to 400 million was spent in Georgia over the course of all of this time between election and runoff? That's just one example. George Santos notwithstanding, where there was fake money rolling around, there are tens of millions of dollars floating around in nearly every election race. How has that money cycle changed Congress and congressional output? And how, if any, can this be changed, and how can it be changed for the better?
So in my view, there are two countervailing forces at work in campaign finance currently as it pertains to members of Congress. And I don't think we understand either of them very well, certainly not the discipline of political science. We don't understand that very well. But so on the one hand, you have members of Congress who now seem to need to appeal to the mega donors, super PACs, 501c organizations, who can spend virtually unlimited amounts of money in a race, of course, without coordination with candidates. But they're trying to influence the outcome of those races. I'd be curious to hear Amy's thoughts on this. On the other hand, as you and I discussed recently, Doug, you have members of Congress incorporating new strategies into their efforts to generate the vast sums of money that they need to run successful races. And these new strategies involve micro donations and what we might call rapid response fundraising, where members of Congress are seeking donations in real time in response to legislative actions of the moment. So, case in point, members of Congress were sending emails in between rounds of voting in the speaker race recently in order to get individuals to donate on how they were voting and how that race was unfolding. So, this is new. We're in a digital era, and members of Congress have always been entrepreneurs about figuring out new ways to raise money. And the pressure to raise money is as intense as ever. I already expect a mostly dysfunctional House of Representatives, given the current procedural terrain and the seat split between the parties. But if members of Congress are more focused on how they're going to try to fundraise off their next vote or their next statement in a committee hearing, then that's going to lead to more grandstanding that could crowd out the actual difficult behind the scenes work that needs to get done in order to govern. So we've got this new digital landscape that members of Congress are operating in, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to work. But in terms of the old differentiation between members of Congress as show horses versus workhorses. It seems to me that the new digital era that we're in tends to push members of Congress to be more show horses than workhorses. To be frank, I don't see how anything changes with regard to the current infrastructure with regard to campaign finance. There's no chance that Congress is going to enact campaign finance reform that would address the way that money is raised and spent currently in races. And I don't see that the Supreme Court is going to do anything to reverse its longstanding trend now of limiting regulation of campaign finance. So I think what will change is that as members of Congress use new forms of technologies, candidates generally use new forms of technology to try to raise money and figure out how to spend that money. We might see some differences in how races turn out. But the big issue for congressional races when it comes to campaign finance is that those who challenge incumbents have an incredibly difficult time raising money. And that still seems to be the case, even though there are lots of new avenues that candidates can pursue to try to raise money. And so you have this incredible incumbency advantage. Maybe, things, the way that the sort of Wild West that we have now with regard to campaign finance will change those things. But it will take a lot, given that it seems like we're pretty entrenched in the current campaign finance regime, which basically serves to protect incumbents in office.
Thanks for that. And then, we'll turn to some questions from the audience, which we have here. But I think one thing we want to emphasize is everything we're talking about here has an analytics and data backbone. Whether it's the fundraising that Professor Warrow is talking about, literally how they write their email messages, they'll do an A/B test and do some analytics to see what does better, to the polling that David's talking about, to the long-term relationship building that Amy's talking about. There's both the qualitative piece of the quality of the conversation, plus there's the quantitative measure of the infrastructure themselves. And of course, quite literally everything Becca does, we have a data analytics piece where the folks behind the scenes and now more and more at the front of the scenes are using those quantitative skills for politics, not just on election day, but literally 24/7, 365. So with that, I'm going to turn first to a question from the audience, from an alum. And the question is for Amy, but I think others can chime in here. To what extent is Amy's organization involved in state voting or precinct and district determination? Both issues have a huge impact on voter turnout and voter results.
So I would say some of the donors that are in the progressive kind of infrastructure also support a lot of the work on redistricting. But I have to say, I think the Democrats, for the most part, have been really pro kind of fair, equitable processes and processes that were alike in Arizona. I don't think there is a huge community pushing a lot of the redistricting work. There is the new Eric Holder's group, the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, that tries to bring some transparency and more of a Democrat capital D perspective to a lot of the work. But we're not super involved in state level map making and redistricting. I would say for the most part, progressives are for independent commissions. Now we can go state by state and say if that was good or bad. Arizona good, Ohio not so good. But yeah, I don't think there is a ton of at least on our side, the progressive infrastructure is not a ton of money in that world. Where we do wind up spending a lot of money is challenging bad maps. And that tends to be progressive funded litigation. So there you go.
No, that's great. And I guess let me ask this question more broadly. Certainly, Democrats and progressives have talked a lot about the challenge of redistricting. Yet in a lot of ways, the numbers this time, if you look at the raw vote total nationally for Republicans versus Democrats, and the output, the number of seats that were won, were pretty close, or if anything, Democrats may have actually overperformed their vote total. So let me just let you in, Becca, quickly, and David as well. Is the redistricting question sort of overblown, or are people competing better? What's going on there?
And I mean, the data does, yeah, I think bear out in this case at least. It was sort of a wash, although it's very dependent state by state. But what I will say is there were a lot of actual close House elections this cycle, but one of the biggest consequence of this last round of redistricting was that there are many fewer competitive districts than there were before. So I think that is challenging for many reasons for both sides. One of them is like, you know, we don't run as competitive of races. We don't reach like more moderate candidates. We don't build a bench of moderate candidates. There's like a number of things that I think is not good for America when you don't have these competitive districts. So I think that's actually, from my perspective, maybe less like polarized, but just as a person who wants a functioning government, I think that's maybe the biggest consequence of this last round.
Excellent. Thank you. David, what are your thoughts about that, about redistricting and its impact, whether it's overblown, what impact you're seeing it happen?
Well, having actually led the redistricting effort and in terms of line drawing in 1990 at the RNC and being heavily involved in 2000, I'm pretty familiar with it. And actually what Becca gets to, I think, is an important byproduct of what occurs, and that is you may have a situation where you've got these competitive seats and they're relatively balanced and they can go back and forth, but the number of them is slowly decreasing. And what that basically does is it creates a very difficult situation. One, if you're a legislative leader within one of those, in terms of either the House or the Senate, or I'm sorry, in the House rather, on the Republican or Democrat side, you have a situation where the people who elect you is the base, but how you become speaker is the other folks. And it's just this constant battle in terms of how do you balance that out and make it move forward. And typically when majorities fall apart, it's when that base swing element within a conference basically stop agreeing and trying to work with each other because they develop fights. And that's how majorities fall apart. And I think that's been exacerbated by the fact that there are just less and less competitive seats. What that also does is that doesn't allow as many people to participate in deciding what a Congress is going to look like as well. Having said that, I am not a fan of commissions. I'm not a fan of, I think what has to happen, having done this, is what you need to do is take the pen out of anybody's hand as much as possible and have neutral criteria, because once you have anybody drawing a line, there's bias introduced.
That's great. And, you know, I think my experience is progressives want a commission and Republicans want to win. And that's, it's been a challenge, I think, for our side.
No, and I agree with you. But again, my whole thing is just take the pen away from everybody, right? And create criteria that everybody agrees on, and then you don't have to worry about it. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, David. Okay, so another question from the audience. There are definitely some Republicans that won in Biden districts in 2022, and some of them ran on, you know, national Republican MAGA themes. What do you think is going on that's possible? Is it a turnout issue? Is it an engagement issue? Is it just a, you know, sort of strange thing going on? Or you know, final thing is there's 435 races and anything can happen in any one of them. What are some thoughts on that? Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize it was quite that number. I knew there were at least 9 because there were 9 who signed a letter supporting McCarthy. And you have some conservatives out there who won in those districts. But I'm not sure that they weren't necessarily MAGA themes. What they basically did is they chose specific issues, articulated their particular viewpoints, and obviously that had an appeal to their electorate. Some of them may have been conservative stuff that maybe were sort of things that Trump had been for, but they made it more about the policy themselves and the personality of the originator of it. And you know, one clear example of that is somebody like Dave Schweikert, who's a member of the Freedom Caucus, who won in a Biden district in Arizona. And I mean, it took a couple of days after the election was over before the final count came in. But just a good example, who's very creative in terms of the issue of healthcare and a variety of other things. Clearly a conservative, but was able to articulate issues well enough to be able to win. The other challenge too, again, in these races, you have to look at what the other side was doing. If it was all negative attacks about Trump and how bad Trump is and how bad the candidate, and they never articulated that position, that certainly helps Republican candidates, as it does the inverse the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Professor Warrow, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, one of the takeaways for me from 2022 and you know, sort of the red wave that didn't happen or didn't happen as much as we thought it was going to happen was if you know, I mean, my sense the red wave already happened in 2020 because if you look at the races that were ranked as toss-ups by the Cook Political Report in 2020, Republicans won every single one of those. In 2018, you saw the reverse, right? Where basically the Democrats won pretty much all the toss-up races and even some races that were rated as leaning Republican. And so, of course, redistricting changes, you know, complicates things a bit, but my sense is that Democrats overperformed in 2018. They won in districts that they wouldn't otherwise have won in if Donald Trump was not the focus of the election. And then in 2020, a lot of those gains were lost. Basically, Republicans took back a lot of those seats, and so there wasn't that much geography, you know, in terms of political geography. There wasn't that much territory for Republicans to make gains in. And so, I mean, you did have the anomaly of what happened in the New York area, right? Where you had these 4 seats that were districts where Biden won. There was redistricting there, and that redistricting process was a mess for a variety of reasons. But those districts were still, you know, they maybe not have been as pro-Biden as they were before the lines were redrawn. But you know, Biden still won them by a number of percentage points, and so. You know, I don't, you know, I'm still waiting to see a compelling explanation for that. I've seen lots of different hypotheses offered, but you know, the idea that these districts were in the blast radius of New York media, where the focus was just all about crime, and somehow, you know, these districts were subject to a different set of dynamics than than other districts. So, but you know, to Becca's point about like all these races that are very close, I mean, a lot of these races end up being, you know, essentially coin flips, right? They're in the margin of error, you know, statistically speaking, and that's true for presidential elections too. If you look at which states go which way. And so, you know, there's something going on here where, you know, either, you know, we figured out how to draw district lines in a particular way to make races, especially House races, you know, so close that you really are just kind of fighting at the margins over a set of voters like the independents that David was talking about.
So we've got a softball from the crowd, and you better answer this correctly, panelists, but we'll start with Amy and Becca, which is, are there any political talent skill set gaps that you see making an impact? And specifically, what are these skill set gaps that how could they best be filled by somebody who's interested in being part of politics? I'll start with you, Amy, but let Becca have Amy, you can set it up, and Becca, you can hit it out of the park. Amy, go ahead.
Everything is data driven. Everything that we do, everything we spend money on, everything that we, I thought that fundraising example, Professor Warrow, was super interesting. I had thought about the real time. I had thought a lot about ActBlue and how that made fundraising very immediate, but not the like real time sending you the email. Of course, I get them. So that is fascinating. Every single one of those is a data decision. How to raise the money, how to get your vote out, et cetera. So Yeah, I will leave more to Becca to decipher, but to add to, but there is nothing that happens in a campaign that we don't count and measure.
Excellent. Becca.
It's almost like you placed a mole in the audience here.
Yeah, who is this?
I don't know about this. No, no, I think that's right. And I would say, in thinking about like the people I hire and work with, if you're actually working in specifically, on my team in analytics, there are lots of ways to get there. You can be an engineer, you can be a data scientist, there's whatever. But I actually think anyone who is responsible for campaign strategy today and moving forward has to have a very strong fundamental understanding of analytics. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going out and building a predictive model every day. And I'm not doing that either, right? Like there are actually, there are people with their PhDs in statistics who can do that. And that is not me. But if you're going to make a budget decision, you have to understand probability. If you are going to do voter targeting, you have to know how aggregation works. If you're going to do messaging, you have to be able to read a poll. You have to be able to understand margins of error. If you're going to be a lawyer, you have to know how databases work. Like there's actually the amount of stuff that data has tentacles in now on campaigns is basically universal. There's not one department from the Biden campaign in 2020 that my team did not work with, not a single one. So I think it's no longer possible to, say, oh, I'm not a math person. Like that, this is actually core to how we make decisions now. All of our decision making, you have to have some understanding. I would have said I wasn't a math person for a long time too. So it's not like you have to had taken, AP calculus. I never did that, but I do think you have to do this work responsibly, to make the kind of decisions we're making with the scale of money and data that we have. You have to be able to wrap your head around all these pieces. So to me, it's fundamental for anyone making decisions in politics.
That's couldn't have said it better, Becca. That's fantastic. So thank you for joining. If you'd like to learn more about the Master of Science in Political Analytics program at Columbia, please register for an upcoming information session. You see a QR code, very high tech here. That's next Wednesday, February 1st at 6 p.m. That's of course virtual. And just if you start to become involved with this program, you'll see we are partnering with employers as well. If you take a look at different firms, people are hiring all the time, and the skills that you develop through a program like this are, I don't think there are many other ways you can say, do this program, here are the jobs that have the skills that need them. And it's a really good way to be relevant in politics and build a career in politics and advocacy. I just want to say thank you to everybody. This will turn off in a minute. Please be sure, if you're interested in more, to check out the information session and keep your eyes on the space for other events. So thank you, everybody.